I think you should be able to see it now. That come through? Thumbs
You're
up?
good.
Awesome. All right. So the way that this kind of came about, maybe I'll give you some backstory with it, is we were finding that within functions, we were doing succession planning, traditional 9-box, and leaders are being developed for positions within their function. Yet we also know that there's need across the entire system. So repositioning how we look at succession planning has been important for us to understand, especially as we think about this renewed and focused commitment to preparing key talent across the system. Because at the end of the day, some of us, we may have a desire to stay at the same level, but broaden our footprint. Or some leaders have a desire to move up, but maybe to move up in a different area. So how are we considering that? A phrase that someone had once shared with me, I thought was really powerful, is who owns talent in the organization? And it's not a leader of a function, maybe even it's not the CEO, but it's the organization owns its talent together, and how we foster community through that shared approach. So that's really why we're doing this, or where it came from. And so some of the things that may come into play for us and how it promotes is like with the Carilion Clinic system level talent pipeline, and looking at it across the board, making sure that we have a consistent application of Carilion's leadership competencies, which are based on the NCHL competencies. And we've tweaked a few things to make that further more Carilion centric. I think Jeannie Armentrout had shared that broadly in one of the coffee chats about it. And aligning with development and effectiveness efforts across the system, and creating an agile bench. And I'm curious to hear from the group what you're experiencing or seeing from a, oh gosh, I don't know what the right phrasing would be, but where our talent in our systems is either shifting out of clinical into administrative, or even out of healthcare altogether. And I think that's a national trend that we're hearing about, at least. And so how we create that agility in the bench, and even having different generations where we don't have this gap in intellect and experience. And so we also have found, from a succession planning standpoint, what it was causing, and I hate that phrase, hoarding, but we were seeing that people were wanting to keep their talent within the function, or they didn't want great people in their department to move into other areas. I'm seeing some nodding, so it sounds like you guys are seeing this as well. And we were worried that it was reducing some of this lateral move opportunity. So just the reframe to kind of think of how we look at talent across the system. So before I keep moving, I am curious what you guys are experiencing, or if you're relating to any of this and the why behind it, or what you've seen with like talent hoarding and things of that nature, competition among departments. I hate to be negative, but it seems like that's some of the things that could happen. Any reflections on that?
Jennifer, this is LaDonna at Stanford Children's. This is a great opportunity because we are in the midst of going through our talent reviews and calibrating right now. And so this talent readiness promotion versus succession planning is great. I didn't think about it that way. And so you're absolutely right. And we are experiencing all of the same challenges at our health system as well. One of the things that has come up for me as a challenge is that the talent review process is more of an event, right? An annual event that we do, and then this really strong commitment to talent and talent mobility, and then it kind of gets lost in the work, and so it's not being used from a TA perspective, or looking at it when we have open positions. So I think integrating it just beyond the executive or the talent review process, and how do we actually make it part of how we look at talent and how we promote people vertically and horizontally across the organization.
Thank you for sharing that. That's something I think that's so incredibly powerful to see, of how this has legs long term. Yeah.
Hey, Jennifer, this is Melissa at Cone Health, and it's interesting. So I don't think we see talent hoarding, and I don't know the word I would use for it, but what we see is, let's say a leader has 6 direct reports, and they've been told by the head of succession planning that they can put 2 people in a formal succession plan. So where does that leave the other four? Do they feel like I'm not good enough to move into anything else in the organization? So it's definitely not the hoarding phenomenon. It's something else, like you've left them in the dust type of thing. And so, but it's based on a firm succession planning model versus a talent readiness.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me show you how we're thinking of framing it too. And I think that that will speak to some of the point you're talking about. I think that the non-box has such great value. And even to that point, maybe it is putting people in different places, but really thinking about how people, who wants to move up, who has high performance. And so this is something we're playing with. Curious to get your perspective. So how we bring this to life altogether. Sorry about my animations. I don't really like to get those out of there. So the way that this framework is set up and how we want to launch this, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're planning for FY22 for us, is first, I think we need to do some assessment. We need to understand who are the people across the system from different levels of leadership that want to move up, that have that desire to move up, and how do we identify those people in a way that maybe their one up doesn't know it, doesn't see it, but a peer one up sees it or knows it, or they want to self-identify and say, you know, I want to move up in the organization, or I want to expand in the organization. So who has desire and who has performance. So how we assess that and what that process looks like. Then we want to take that even deeper of those that, for example, are high talent or high performing, but don't necessarily have a desire to expand. Can we shift them? Can we shift their perspective where they may want to move into a greater role and have greater responsibility? Then, of course, identifying participants for an emerging leader program. So doing something very specific, and I call it a program on purpose versus a process, because I think it's something that it comes together for a specific period of time. It's a cohort of individuals, and after their 6 months, probably that's what we're thinking, they are put on a very specific high performer bench. And so perfect world, the way I see that bench looking is that it's like a LinkedIn, an internal LinkedIn for talent acquisition, where we're pulling the best internal candidates for a position based on character, based on vitality, some of these other characteristics, maybe beyond technical skill set. So what we want to do in 22 is starting to look at how that assessment process looks like. So it's kind of like the top box of a non-box, but with a little bit of a different spin. But how we're looking at those who have both high desire, high performance, and those who have low desire, high performance. So they're not really they don't know that they want to move up or expand, but they have high performance. Can we shift them? So working with our HR business directors, some of you may have HR business partners or similar role, with other leaders in the system, and also ultimately asking people in those roles as well, so that we're getting a broad perspective and using things like retention, goal achievement, competency 360. So the next thing that we want to do in this first fiscal year is going a little bit deeper with that. So of those people who are high performance, high desire, what are their aspirations? Do they want to do a lateral move, or do they want to shift from clinical to non-clinical? We talked a little bit about that. What are their timeline expectations? Because that, I think, is something that's going to impact retention of top talent, is what they're at least understanding their expectation. Not to say that we can meet it, but understanding it and what that risk is of turnover, because ultimately this is to keep top talent in the organization or in the industry, and how we share that. What their motivations are, why they want to expand or move up, and having some expectations of what the program looks like, because they'll be in a pilot. I'll pause there. Diane, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. This is all really interesting to me, so thank you for sharing. Just a quick question, just up until this point, I'm noticing the lack of use of the word potential. And so is that by design, and is there a rationale? Because often when you think about succession planning or talent readiness, potential is in the mix. Nope.
She might have froze.
No, I stunned her with my question.
Oh, I think
Sorry,
you're back.
I heard the piece about potential. Yes, that is something that the team has talked about as we do this aspirational work of where does potential fit? Like if we look at that box, and I apologize if I didn't get the rest of it, but how do we weave in potential when we think about performance and where that comes into play. Do you have any thoughts, suggestions, ideas on that, of how we can weave that into those pieces of assessment?
I mean, we're fairly early in this journey. We've been using CEB's model of potential and working with the business and the business partners to identify people who have, meet these kind of observable behaviors that can potentially show as potential. Like I said, we're still early on in the process, and desire becomes part of it, because aspiration is one of the pieces of that model as to how much, do they want to do something more than what they're doing currently? I'm curious to what others are doing.
This is Christy. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me now, but when you were going through the model, I was thinking the same thing. Where does potential fit? And then I just concluded that it was probably captured in the employee's desire, because I think you're right in terms of the potential the employee has to have in order to articulate that desire, not just that they want to move up, but what do they want to do so that that development plan can be built. So I guess I was on the same mindset, but maybe capturing the potential in the employee's desire.
And it makes me wonder too, if potential is part of, it's part of desire, but it's also part of performance as well, because we will be able to see that in their potential of how they're performing. Where that some of those hidden strengths are, or not hidden, but maybe the strengths that aren't so obvious. Thank you. That's a great point.
So Jennifer, I have a question. I'm just trying to map this to what we're doing at Hopkins, and we are looking at performance and leadership potential, and we are using high potentials. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how this fits in. When you say high performance, are you assuming in accomplishing the work they're doing as well as leadership potential? Is that all rolled in?
Yes. So it's capturing things like character, vitality, like leadership competency, as well as goal achievement, building engagement, and function.
And so if you're doing that, if you're putting it all together, are you able to identify people who might be those core employees, high performers, but may not have leadership potential? Do you focus on them at all?
Through this process, we really want to focus on those who do want to move, or that maybe are high performing, low desire, and are they shiftable? So that's where that comes into play, I think. And I think that there's a greater body of work, especially when we've done succession planning with 9Box, where we've looked at those who are what I would consider to be the subject matter experts that we want to keep in the organization,
Core.
and try to push them into leadership. Sometimes we want to stay in that role.
Right. Okay, thank you.
That's a great question. Share with you guys a couple more pieces as we go in, and Tara's going to talk a little bit about how this impacts some additional levels in the organization. So when it comes to identifying participation or into an emerging leader program, we do think that needs to be a multi-pronged approach. We like the idea of them giving presentations that could be time intensive, but I think that will also show a lot about one's acumen in how they carry themselves, how they influence, how they respond to different scenarios, and how they present themselves to separate out. So a little bit about our process for identifying. But behind the scenes really is where I believe that some of the magic is happening with the group and what we're building. And that's in understanding truly what are those characteristics of a solid leader, not just today, but in the future. And as we can see in our own experiences, it's a tough time to lead. And our leaders are experiencing, and I'm sure you're feeling the same way, friction. How do we build this frictionless regenerative model of leadership? And what does that actually look like? How do we benchmark it? How do we measure it? And then for us, we really want to focus on a Carilion-centric approach. So what does this mean in our region and our community and the culture of our organization? So understanding some of those key drivers, what those success factors are. We do think we need to partner with either an external and internal partners on how we benchmark success in certain functions and roles, but that has that space to grow and evolve. So we'll be working on researching best practices for an emerging leader program and what that looks like, how we understand high potential, high performing high desire leaders and what they need to do to elevate and expand, doing trend analysis with their group. Tara, do you want to talk a little bit more about how we're doing it at all levels and identifying and some other from our manager, supervisor, staff level?
Sure, absolutely. Alicia, I saw your hand up earlier. Did you still have a question?
Thanks. I can wait to the end. It has to do though with the high motivation and whether that limits the demographics. Women and people of color in particular are sort of notorious for not having that high motivation unless they're asked. So that was my question. If you're seeing a demographic, maybe a certain demographic that falls into that box.
That falls into the highly motivated versus.
Yes.
We're not seeing it so much. At least I'm not seeing it from our end, and anyone else that's joined that's from the ILE team, or Tara, if you have any insight on that as well. We're not seeing a huge difference, but I follow where you're coming from too, that there's a tap on the shoulder kind of opportunity I think we need to have with people where we see that maybe they're not asking for it, but that it's, hey, I see something in you. I want to sponsor you, kind of that mentality.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and that will be woven into our programs too. The part that I wanted to talk about today was how we're really making talent ready at all levels. So it's not just with the leaders that we have in place formally now, but it's with our employees. And so we're trying to look ahead for what's needed in the workforce of the future, identifying the talent across the board. You never know when you have employees sitting at different places in your organization that they could eventually become your next CEO or COO. So we think about those things as we're developing these programs. So we always have programs available to our employees to continuously develop them. So whether we're thinking about their communication skills, we want them to be ready for whatever is next in their role. And so it's always thinking about what's the core curriculum in delegation, what's the core curriculum in communication. So we're always thinking about those as a way to foster their continued growth and make them ready for the next opportunity. So we do have opportunities around, shadowing, mentorship, and coaching. And we want to give rotation opportunities early in the careers for our leaders. And so when Jennifer was talking a little bit about that talent hoarding, what you find at Carilion is people tend to come into an area and they sort of grow where they were planted, right? So we don't always see some of the movement in the organization that we would like. And sometimes that hinders their ability as leaders. So they come in and maybe they don't understand sort of the IT function, or they don't understand the different functions that would help them to be a well-rounded leader. So we're looking to give our leaders opportunities early in their career so they can rotate through areas such as quality, IT, human resources, finance, just to give them some well-grounded foundation. We are using simulation. So Jennifer talked a little bit about this from the standpoint that sometimes at Carilion, we see leaders understand their leaders very well, and they have strong opinions about where they should move and how they should move. And sometimes those opinions are good, but they're not always objective. And I'm sure you find this in your organization as well. So we try to get to know our leaders and our employees. We identify them. We hopefully have enough eyes on them that we can identify sort of the strengths and the gaps as part of the simulation that they might go through at different parts and times in our organization. And then I think Jennifer alluded to this as well, but we're trying to find a way to comprehensively look at our leaders, especially, and have multiple data sources that we're bringing together so that we understand a lot of things about them, how they're currently performing, how do they perform under difficult circumstances, what are their goals, what have been their goals in the last 5 years, were there certain significant projects that they participated in. So we're looking at how to get a comprehensive review to look at our leaders more globally. So we have lots of people giving opinions and we have lots of data sources. So next slide. So we're really doing, as you all, I'm sure, we're doing a lot of increased activities around diverse talent. And that really includes developing those pipelines. So Carilion has taken a very active role in partnering with universities, colleges, community colleges, our state legislator, and diverse employers. And what we're doing is we've created a consortium of different employers, all these groups that come together that talk about what we need in the future. We're bringing all those great minds together. We're bringing the funding together. We're getting the right programs developed. And all of this is in preparation for understanding that we're going to eventually need those leaders. So let's attract the very best talent we can. Let's get them here. Let's get them excited. Let's get them developed and moved up into leadership opportunities. So we're doing a lot of work in creating transparency in our career paths. So once you're here, it's very clear to you how you can move around in the organization. And then, although this is an uphill battle, as it probably is in most organizations, what we're trying to do is to create a learning culture. And I think we have a learning culture. Sometimes what we don't have, and Jennifer talked about this too, is we don't think about moving somebody else to the next opportunity. Again, we sort of tend to grow people where they are planted. So if you came into the laundry or materials management or the ED, that's kind of sometimes where our employees stay. And we're looking to promote the culture around cultivate in the moment that you have an employee, but plan to move them to the next place that they will grow. So Jennifer and I just have a few questions. Of course, we all like it when it's more interactive. So we'll open it back up to the group for additional questions, but also to talk to you about some of your talent readiness or succession planning in your organizations.
Thank you. Yes, so one of the first questions that Tara and I have is, how do you all assess across the system equitably? And the reason we say equitably is, sometimes we will see that, kind of to your point, Dr. Brownfield, about how one might not speak up and say, hey, I want to move up, I want to move over, I want to expand. How are we making sure that we're tapping into the best talent and giving a voice, creating a space to be heard across the system? So how are you all doing it? How are you assessing talent across the system equitably, or bringing forth and creating space for a voice?
I can, this is LaDonna again at Stanford. One of the things that we're looking at, and I really appreciate the question because it's been challenging to be really frank. And the reason for that is there's sensitivity to the need to create a diverse culture and inclusive culture. And as we look at the analytics, we could see that the further up you go into the organization, the less diverse it becomes. And so one of our success measures is to really try to balance that out with great intention. And so one of the strategies that we're implementing now is we're going deeper into the organization. So we're moving away from succession planning being for sort of this top tier leaders and looking at critical roles to really going down to the line and really understanding our full leadership bench. So that we can really not just identify, but include leaders that may be early on in their careers with a emerging accelerated leader program. And so that's one of the initiatives that we're doing in addition to the outreach and transparency. I think that when you see the numbers and you see how where disparity may occur, I think that brings about the commitment and the attention at all levels of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. Terry, had your hand raised? Something you got too?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we struggled with that a lot when we first started the process because we noted that there's bias ultimately in if we're leaving it up to the leader to determine what talent looks like and how performance is assessed. And so we created a scorecard mechanism to really look at outcomes to identify performance. So, things such as do they meet the budget? Are they, what are their engagement scores like with their staff? How do they do with compliance? And, for us, Joint Commission, how are they doing with turnover data in their department, so that we look at more holistically the view of performance. And interestingly enough, we did drop the potential category, because we also noted that as we're moving to try to increase diversity within the leadership, that inherent bias comes in potential. And so we've removed potential and assumed that there is potential with all employees, all leaders, and have taken a little bit of a different turn with that.
Huh.
Terry, I think that's a really good point. I hope we reflected that in our slides too, but that's what we're looking at too, is how do you get a comprehensive picture of your leaders? And sometimes we talk about the health of a leader. How many employee relations issues do they have? How many, what were their engagement scores? How did they do on the budget? How many compliance issues have been notated? So, and in addition to sort of their scope of work within the organization. So we agree, and we'd love to partner and understand sort of what your items are as well. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Wes, did you have a comment, question? Oh, you're on mute. Happens to the best of us.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yes, as Diane mentioned, we're just in the midst of our second organization-wide talent review, and this is a larger review. We're reviewing employees at the manager level, and so we're aiming actually for a group of 90 candidates to be identified from across hospital administration and our corporate staff functions. We have tried to differentiate performance from potential, actually, because we think a lot of the performance data is actually kind of, it has a lot of bias and encodes a lot of assumptions about who contributes. So what we're actually doing is, as we're launching the talent review, we've built a training for vice president level, all vice presidents, and for the people who will be key agents in about 20 different segments of the organization, and facilitating the identification of candidates for the cohort, where we are addressing in a lot more detail that CEB model that Diane mentioned. And we're going over the behaviors related to engagement, aspiration, and ability. And also introducing bias, and it's our second training to this group around bias. We did bias and performance management about 6 months ago. So we're able to we're at least facilitating, I think, some pretty good conversations about how bias and the tendency to identify the same candidates comes up again and again, and hoping that those behaviors will help our leaders to look more broadly and more objectively for potential where it might sit.
That's really fascinating too, of how you're training the VPs to be very articulate in how they assess talent, and how they can become more self-aware of bias that comes into play. I have a couple other questions that Terry and I wanted to maybe bring up, or other points while we're together as well. Let's see. So another one that has come up for us is how we actually measure these factors like character, a leader's capacity, and that can mean a variety of things. How we measure presence, or executive presence, leadership acumen, vitality. How do you guys measure these things? How do you put a tangible metric to it, or how do you look at it? I'll leave it up for a second, and then I'll pause it so we can see each other. And maybe another question is it tough? Do you all think it's tough to measure these pieces?
This is Steve from NYU Langone Health. I'm sure I speak for all of us. It is very tough. Hard to quantify these things. And frankly, I don't think we've cracked the nut quite yet. We rely on the annual performance review. which is hardly adequate. And I know we all agree. And then, you know, in addition, we're just introducing a new scorecard, which is almost a management sort of tool to drive greater management compliance. So we see how well they're going to be doing to that with that. And then I think in addition, the more advanced or better practice is to look at team engagement and identify those managers that are scoring in the bottom quartile and really focus on them to increase their capabilities, to hence increase the capabilities of those lower performing teams. I think that's kind of where we stand.
Thank you. See, that's great to hear. You know, some of it's perception too. We're looking like when I look at these, I think about how are we measuring the impact of coaching, of executive coaching or leadership coaching? And Sarah Kageraz, I just looked to see if she's still on, and she kind of runs that effort within the ILE team. And she did have to step up because we had another meeting right after this. But the way that she's been researching and framing it is looking at perception and how you measure perception. And it gives me some pause. I think about it from a couple of different angles, but are these factors that we mentioned here, are they factors of perception? It's maybe more of a rhetorical or an abstract question though. Any other thoughts on this one?
This is Diane from MSK again. I will say, we actually intentionally, I think, tried to steer clear of measuring these factors just because of the concern around bias. And, you know, what is character to me is, you know, may just be different from how someone else is showing up or presence similarly. And I will say, just as a side note, we have an emerging leader program that we're running right now with director level. And when there's a lot of angst, I would almost say, around the word presence, when you try to tie it to authenticity. And if I'm supposed to show up and being present in the way you're expecting me to be present, but if it's not authentic to who I am because of my gender or my race or whatever, what does that mean? So whether that means there's a gap in our, you know, overall approach, maybe, I don't know, but we've kind of sidestepped this whole topic because we didn't trust that we could do it in a non-biased way.
But thank you for sharing that, because it's so helpful to hear. I think, especially to talk about authenticity, it's very top of mind for us, because in one of our leadership development process, that's a topic that we're working on, and how we talk about authenticity. How do people flex authenticity? Adam Grant has a great podcast, I think it was back in March or April, on how essentially bringing our full selves to work may not always be the best thing to do, and how we flex that in a way that meets people where they are. Very good one if you haven't heard it. It's Work Life with Adam Grant. Thank you.
Hi, this is Rachel from Northwell. Interesting in conversation, and I think everything that you measure is potentially never purely objective, and trying to strive for that objectiveness. And what is presence, and what are any of these leadership qualities that we're looking to measure? One of the things that we try to do as much as possible, as much as when we're measuring programs, when we're measuring performance, is really focus on the behaviors, and very often ask how often those behaviors are being exhibited. So what is executive presence? What are those behaviors that contribute to that? And then how often are people presenting those behaviors? It's nowhere close to perfect, and it's definitely still subjective. And just by nature, I think a lot of what we do in this measurement can be very subjective, but just a thought to be focusing on behaviors.
Frequency of behaviors.
Correct.
And measuring it from that perspective, and clearly defining expectations and things of that nature.
Yeah,
Rachel, are you doing, just curious, are you doing that through self-report, or do you have observers measuring that?
It depends what we're measuring and when we're measuring it, but yes, both.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for sharing.
This is Chris from the Cleveland Clinic, and I would agree with Rachel, because, you know, I would go a step back and say, you know, what does character look like? You know, for us, character is around our organization's values. You know, so the 6 values, and we do make those a part of our annual performance reviews. And so there is some dialogue, there around that. We also have 4 leader behaviors. And so we also, and out of those 4, there's 8 capabilities. So it's, so like capacity, right? What does that mean? What does capacity mean for your organization? What does presence mean for your organization? Because these are very tough to measure. But if you can get a little bit more granular, it becomes a little bit easier to measure.
That's such a great point too, Chris, because what I'm hearing you say is that you connect the values and the behaviors. So what does it look like here in our organization? And that's so much of what we're trying to do at Carilion Clinic is what does an effective leader, broadly using that term, what does an effective leader sound like, look like? What does it feel like to be around them? But what are those specific behaviors that are Carilion centric?
Yeah. And then, the step we took this year is to say, you've got these behaviors, but what are the specific skills that make up that behavior? And really focusing on development on the skill rather than just the behavior.
So how does it really come to life?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Northwell has taken, which has been really helpful, and as we are actually in the process of redefining those behaviors, terming them commitments actually, which is a really interesting process to be a part of, and looking at those behaviors and commitments and what are those by leadership level. So what does that look like? What does this behavior look like at the emerging leader level? What does this behavior look like at the frontline leader, at the leader of leader, and at the executive leader? So knowing that there's different expectations and behaviors even by level. Again, never perfect, but at least tries to. And coming up with those is no easy task either.
Well, I totally agree with you. What we're working on, what Tara and I are working on right now is how the competencies and the ones that we've modified a little bit to be more Carilion centric, but that it's all part of the NCHL framework, what those look like at each level, because it does look a little bit different, and as it should, because different levels of teams have different needs. Maybe even different functions, but we're not going down that route yet. But our internal eye psychologists and some that we partner with externally are looking at that right now to validate it, to understand it. But I think it's a tricky one. I know that we're at time, and I think thank you all so much for talking about this with us and for letting us share what we're doing right now, what our aspirational work is, and to give us a lot to think about. And it's been very helpful. Melanie, do you have other things that you wanted to go through or any other comments?
Jennifer, can I just ask one question? This is Mara from Johns Hopkins. We have the same issue about making this organizational and getting people to look across entities, hospitals. How are you sharing this? Do you have a database, or if there's a leader in one hospital, how do they access information on potential, whatever you're calling them, in other entities or hospitals?
So to connect all the pieces. Well, I think that we're fortunate really in the way our structure is set up, because there's great connectivity among them to begin with. And some functions within what we call our community hospitals, some of those are centralized, but then there's also great connectivity among those. So through those communities of practice and fostering that connectivity through the structure, it happens that way. But then we also have different communication channels where we speak with leaders. Personally, I go on roadshows. So whenever we're launching this, because what Tara and I share with you is the initial, here's what the FY22 work looks like. And then we'll go on a roadshow across the system, and I'll meet with each of the VPs or the dyad partners, so the VP and the chair, and their direct reports within their teams to share, this is what it looks like, and this is what's coming from that. We've done that methodology in the past to get the word out. So kind of treating it like a marketing campaign, internal marketing campaign, but then deliberately bringing these people together in different forums where they're talking to each other about it as well. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, we're just looking to figure out some sort of central secured repository. And I just didn't know if other people were doing
for
anything similar.
Sorry about that. That's a question I have too, of how are you, for those that are much farther along or that have this, where there is a very clear group of leaders that are on the bench, for lack of a better term, how you get that known. I would think for us, it would be the talent acquisition team and our HR business directors, but are others doing that? How are you doing it well? Question.
One of the things that we are doing from the high potential side, so this is leaders who are leader of leaders and they have already been identified as high potential leaders, so they're enrolled in our program. So one of the things that has become a best practice for us is getting the executive sponsors, the clinical service line leaders, our medical directors, our executive directors, so both clinical and non-clinical leadership in the same room for all the participants who are actively enrolled in the program, to have a communication and a dialogue around how those individuals are participating, or what we are seeing from the program's perspective in alignment with what they're seeing on the ground and in their role, and the impact that they're having on the teams that they're working with. And so that's been just really helpful for us to have sort of an ongoing dialogue to talk about the progression that these individuals are going through through the program. And since it is at that higher level where we do have individuals from throughout our large organization, it does allow those conversations to happen at a higher level. And so, there are some leaders who may have a need, and there's another, there may be another individual who is growing and ready to kind of occupy that space, and there might not be any place for them to go where they, kind of the bench that they're sitting on. And so it does allow for that visibility on a larger scale. So we found that that's something that's been really helpful from a programmatic perspective.
That's so helpful to hear too, because it creates that visibility across the system, because that's really what we're trying to do, is create that system view where one might be an excellent VP of orthopedic administration, but would also be an excellent VP of one of our community hospitals. And so that there's that connectivity. Thank you again, y'all. This is very helpful. I know it's helpful for me, and hopefully it's a great discussion for you all as well. Yeah.
Did anyone have any other questions of the Carilion team? And thank you both so much for this amazing discussion.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Yeah, please let us know if you have other ideas or anything like that, or we can answer any other questions.
I wonder if it's possible to get people who might be interested together for further discussion as we're all trying to figure out the best path forward.
We can absolutely coordinate that.
Thanks.
If you are interested in being connected with one another, you can reach out to me and we can create a subgroup for succession planning.
Yeah, I just put that in the chat too, so put me on the list.
Excellent. Sounds good. Perfect. The entire council is going to come back and say yes. So it sounds like a continued conversation. The one thing that I will say before we wrap up our time together is Patty and I chatted, and we'd really like to bring executive coaching into the mix, but continue the succession planning route. So if any organization is particularly good at using executive coaching for succession planning, we'd love to kind of add that to our agenda for the kind of finalizing and rounding out this year. So if you want to present, it doesn't have to be perfect. Obviously, Carilion is still in their journey. So please speak up and let us know. Patty, is there anything else you would add to that or this discussion in general? You're on mute.
Double mute. I think it's really just the fact that we know there are experts among us, and really wanting to be able to share in the community of best practices. And everybody's organization does things a little bit differently. And so sharing that information will either spark some hopeful opportunities for each of us to either try something new or question is there a different or better way to do it. Just quickly with regard to the coaching piece, is I would also say if you have the internal bandwidth and how you're using either internal or external coaching for development, because I know some of your organizations may rely more heavily on the internal developed coach versus the external organization.
Thanks, Patty. I want to real quick, I'm getting a lot of chats on the side, so I'm currently managing my chats as well. I know Johns Hopkins had a question about mandatory training for discrimination and maybe was it unconscious bias? I forget the other portion of that. I am going to see if we can add it to our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council agenda, which is towards the end of the month. But I think this was also posted as a discussion board post among the members in this group. So if anyone has an answer to that question and feels like going into there and replying, they would deeply appreciate it. And I just wanted to call attention back to that. Maura or Afua, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think you captured it quite well. I'm just seeking to know how discrimination and harassment training is rolled out and what others are doing. So I'd appreciate any responses on that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm going to save the chat here, but I see a few people saying they have quite the robust coaching program. So I will be reaching out to you all. Otherwise, I hope you all have an excellent day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Great
Bye. Thank you.
presentation, Jennifer.
Good meeting.
Bye.
Thanks.